I still get chills thinking about that night, even though 5 years have passed. We were just teenagers looking for a thrill, but what happened in Sarah's basement changed us forever. I remember checking my phone. It was exactly 11:47 p.m. when everything went wrong. The four of us had been joking around, telling ghost stories, when Emma suggested we make a Ouija board. "Come on, it'll be fun," she said, pulling out a piece of cardboard and a marker. We shouldn't have done it. We shouldn't have tempted fate. But we were young and stupid, drunk on energy drinks, and the excitement of being unsupervised. If I had known what would happen next, I would have run out of that house and never looked back. The basement had always been creepy, with its old stone walls and that musty smell that seemed to seep into your clothes. But that night, as we sat in our circle with only flashlights illuminating our faces, something felt different. The air grew heavy, like the moment before a thunderstorm, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that we could see our breath. Sarah had lived in that Victorian house her entire life, and there had always been rumors about its history. Her parents bought it for a suspiciously low price back in 2000, and the previous owners had moved out in a hurry, leaving behind furniture and personal belongings. We'd heard whispers about a family tragedy in the 1970s, but Sarah always brushed off the stories as neighborhood gossip. That night, we arranged ourselves on the cold concrete floor, our knees touching as we formed a tight circle. Emma had drawn the letters and numbers on the cardboard in thick black marker, adding yes and no in the corners. We used an upturned shot glass as our planchette, our fingertips barely touching its smooth surface. The basement walls seemed to close in around us, and the shadows cast by our flashlights danced like twisted figures on the ceiling. Looking back, I should have noticed how the flame of the nearby scented candle remained perfectly still, despite the draft that usually plagued the basement. We started with innocent questions, giggling nervously as the glass moved uncertainly across the board. "Is anyone there?" Emma asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt to sound confident. The glass moved slowly at first, then with increasing certainty toward yes. We exchanged excited glances, each of us silently accusing the others of moving it. But then things took a darker turn. The glass began spelling out a name, Elizabeth. The temperature dropped even further, and my skin erupted in goosebumps. Sarah's face went pale. "That was the name of the girl," she whispered. "The one who died here in the 70s. None of us had known this detail before. The shot glass moved again, faster now, spelling out HELPME. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The candle flame suddenly grew tall and blue, casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls. That's when we saw it, a dark shape, like a mass of black smoke, materializing in the corner of the basement. It wasn't just a shadow. It had depth and substance, and it seemed to absorb the light around it. We all fell silent, our eyes fixed on the apparition. The shot glass began moving violently across the board, spelling out words too quickly to follow. Sarah started crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Emma tried to remove her fingers from the glass, but it felt ice cold and seemed to be stuck to our skin. The black mass began to move, slowly at first, then with frightening speed, streaking across the wall toward the basement stairs. We screamed in unison, finally breaking contact with the shot glass, which shattered instantly into countless tiny pieces. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the basement like a gunshot, and then everything went completely silent. After several minutes of frozen terror, we gathered enough courage to investigate. The basement stairs had never seemed so long or threatening. We climbed them slowly, our flashlight beams dancing wildly as our hands shook. At the top of the stairs, we found something that made my blood run cold. Sarah's childhood doll, the one that always sat on the hallway shelf, was lying face down on the floor. This wasn't just any doll. It was a porcelain antique that had belonged to her grandmother, and it was always carefully positioned, facing the front door. Now it lay there, as if thrown by an invisible hand, its painted eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. What terrified me most was that the doll was warm to the touch, as if it had been held by human hands, despite the freezing temperature of the house. Things escalated quickly after that. The lights throughout the house began flickering, and we heard footsteps above us, even though we knew we were alone in the house. A child's laughter echoed through the halls, followed by heart-wrenching sobs. The doll, when we looked back at it, had somehow moved again, now sitting upright and facing the basement door. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and I swear its expression had changed from the vacant smile to something more sinister. Sarah started screaming that she could see someone standing at the end of the hallway, a small figure in a white dress, but when we turned to look, it vanished. The temperature continued to drop until we could see our breath in the air, and the walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. We ran from the house that night and didn't stop until we reached Emma's home 3 blocks away. In the days that followed, strange things happened to each of us. Our phones would ring with no caller ID, playing only static, and what sounded like a child's whispered pleas. Sarah's doll disappeared entirely, only to reappear in random places around her house, always facing the basement door. But the most chilling part? When Sarah's parents developed photos from an old camera they found in the basement weeks later, there was one that made us question everything. It showed our Ouija board session from that night, taken from the corner where we'd seen the black mass. In the photo, we're all there, fingers on the shot glass, but there's something else. A small figure in a white dress standing behind us, her hand reaching toward Emma's shoulder. I still can't sleep some nights, remembering that cold basement and the horrors we unleashed. Sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can hear a child's laughter and feel cold fingers brushing against my neck. I still can't sleep with my window open, not after what happened that night. It's been 5 years since that sleepover at Emily's house, but every creak, every shadow makes my heart race. We were just 2 16-year-old girls having a normal Friday night, watching horror movies and laughing about how unrealistic they were. If only we knew what real horror felt like. The sound that changed everything wasn't a dramatic crash or a scream. It was the soft scraping of metal against metal, so faint that at first, I thought I was imagining it. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch downstairs, and I was alone in her second-floor bedroom, scrolling through my phone. The noise came again, and this time, I saw it. Fingers, pale and dirty, curling around the window frame. My blood turned to ice as I watched those fingers slowly push the window up, inch by excruciating inch. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't move. I just lay there, frozen, as a dark figure began to emerge from the darkness outside. The streetlight behind him cast his face in shadow, but I could see enough to know this wasn't some teenager playing a prank. His movements were too deliberate, too practiced. He hadn't seen me yet. The bed was positioned just out of view from the window. My phone's screen suddenly felt too bright, like a beacon in the darkness. With trembling fingers, I slowly slid it under my pillow, trying not to make a sound. The man was halfway through the window now, and I could hear his breathing, shallow and quick, like an animal's. My mind raced through every self-defense video I'd ever watched, every crime documentary I'd seen, but nothing prepared me for this moment. The reality was so much worse than anything I'd imagined. I thought about Emily downstairs sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the danger above. I needed to warn her, but how? The bedroom door seemed miles away, and the floorboards in Emily's house creaked like they were designed to betray any movement. The intruder paused, and I heard him mutter something under his breath. What happened next still haunts my nightmares. The man pulled something from his jacket, a phone. Its blue light illuminated his face for just a moment, and I saw what he was wearing. A medical mask, but not the kind we're used to seeing. This one was old, yellowed, with dark stains across its surface. He began texting someone, his fingers moving rapidly. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a random break-in. They had planned this. But who was they? And why here? Why tonight? The questions raced through my mind as I lay there, barely breathing, watching him finish his message and return the phone to his pocket. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, so loud I was certain he would hear it too. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold, another scraping noise, but this time from downstairs. Someone else was breaking in. The man at the window turned his head sharply, listening. He raised his hand to his ear, and I saw a small black device, an earpiece. "She's still asleep," a voice crackled through it. "Ready when you are." Everything happened at once. I heard Emily scream downstairs, a sound so terrified and primal it didn't even sound human. The man at the window whirled around, finally spotting me on the bed. Our eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Then survival instinct kicked in. I rolled off the bed just as he lunged forward, his hands grabbing at empty air where I had been seconds before. I scrambled underneath the bed, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Emily's screams had turned to muffled sounds, and heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. The man circled the bed, his boots inches from my face. "She's under here," he called out, his voice surprisingly soft and calm. That's when I saw it. A small can of pepper spray that Emily kept taped under her bed frame. I'd made fun of her paranoia when she showed it to me earlier that night. Now it might be the only thing that could save us. I wrapped my fingers around it just as another pair of boots entered the room. They were talking to each other in low voices, discussing something about the parents and the safe. I didn't think, I just acted. I rolled out from under the far side of the bed, springing to my feet and spraying the pepper spray in a wide arc. Both men screamed, stumbling backward, clawing at their eyes. I ran past them, nearly falling down the stairs in my panic. In the living room, I found Emily. She was tied up but conscious, her eyes wide with terror. A third man was standing over her, but he turned when he heard the commotion upstairs. I didn't stop running. I slammed into him with all my weight, catching him off guard. We both crashed into Emily's mother's prized china cabinet. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, and I felt sharp pain as pieces sliced into my arms, but adrenaline kept me moving. I grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her up. She couldn't run with her feet bound, so I half-carried, half-dragged her toward the front door. Behind us, I could hear shouting and the thundering of footsteps. My fingers fumbled with the locks, slick with blood from the cuts. We made it outside, but they were right behind us. Emily's next-door neighbor, Mr. Peterson, was outside walking his dog. The sight of two teenage girls, one bound and both bloody, running out of a house at midnight made him drop his dog's leash and pull out his phone. The men must have seen him too because they stopped chasing us. We heard their footsteps retreating, followed by the sound of breaking glass from the back of the house. By the time the police arrived 4 minutes later, they were gone. They found evidence that the men had been watching the house for days. Photographs, notes about our routines, details about Emily's parents' work schedules. They had known exactly when the house would be vulnerable. The police said we were lucky. If I hadn't been awake, if Emily hadn't screamed, if I hadn't found that pepper spray, any small change could have led to a very different outcome. They never caught the men, but they did find their van abandoned a few miles away. Inside were maps of other houses in the area, each one marked with notes and schedules. 5 years later, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath of that night. Emily and I both went through therapy, but some scars don't heal completely. I learned later that there had been a string of similar break-ins across 3 states, all targeting homes where the parents worked in banking or finance. Emily's dad was a bank manager, and they had been after the codes to the bank's security system. The case is still open, and sometimes I catch myself looking at strangers' hands, searching for those pale, dirty fingers I saw at the window. Emily's family moved away shortly after, but we still keep in touch. We share a bond that no one else can understand. Every year on that night, we call each other, just to check in, to remind ourselves that we survived. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night, the detail that makes this story more than just a frightening memory. Last week, I received a text from an unknown number. It was just 4 words, but they made my blood freeze. "Windows open. See you." I've triple-checked every lock in my house since then, but I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, they're watching, waiting for the right moment to finish what they started that night. I still wake up in cold sweats, thinking about that night at Leora's house. What started as an innocent sleepover turned into the most terrifying 12 hours of my life. I should have noticed the warning signs when I arrived, the way she kept checking her phone, her nervous glances at the clock, how she barely touched her dinner. but I was just excited to spend time with my best friend of 3 years. If only I'd known that by midnight, I'd be desperately trying to figure out if the person sitting across from me was still the Leora I knew, or if she'd ever been that person at all. The interrogation started with a simple question that made my blood run cold. "Tell me exactly where you were last Tuesday at 3:47 p.m. Her voice was different, colder, mechanical almost. When I hesitated, her face changed in a way I can't describe, like a mask slipping ever so slightly. That's when I realized I wasn't just her friend anymore. I was a prisoner in her house, and this night was going to be about survival. The questions kept coming, each one more specific and unsettling than the last. Leora had transformed from my bubbly best friend into something else entirely. She wanted to know about conversations I'd had months ago, exactly what I'd worn on specific dates, people I'd talked to in passing. Her eyes never blinked as she stared at me, waiting for answers. The worst part was how she'd smile when I got something wrong, this knowing, twisted smile that made my stomach churn. The living room felt smaller with each passing minute, the walls seeming to close in around us. The cheerful photos of her family on the walls started to feel like they were watching me, judging me. I tried to laugh it off, to pretend this was some elaborate game, but my laughter died in my throat when she pulled out a thick folder filled with photos of me going about my daily life, photos I never knew existed. That's when I realized this wasn't a spontaneous interrogation. She'd been planning this for months. My phone was dead, and Leora had somehow managed to block all the exits without me noticing. The windows were secured with new locks I hadn't seen when I arrived, and the front door had a security system that definitely wasn't there during my last visit. She must have installed everything just for this night. The questions started getting darker, more accusatory. "Why did you really become friends with me?" she demanded, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Who sent you to watch me?" Nothing I said seemed to satisfy her. Each answer only made her more agitated, more convinced of some conspiracy I knew nothing about. The room temperature seemed to drop with every passing hour, and the shadows in the corners grew longer, darker. I started noticing things I'd missed before: cameras in the potted plants, a voice recorder under the coffee table, and most disturbing of all, a wall calendar with this date circled in red, marked with my name. Around 3 a.m., Leora's questioning took an even darker turn. She started talking about a secret organization she believed was watching her, claiming I was one of their agents. She produced documents, news clippings, and detailed timelines she'd created, all pointing to some massive conspiracy. The terrifying part wasn't just her delusions, it was the methodical way she'd pieced together random moments from our friendship into evidence. Every time I'd been late to meet her, every canceled plan, every text message that took too long to respond to, she documented everything, twisted it all into proof of her paranoid theories. My heart nearly stopped when she pulled out a small box from under the couch. Inside were items I'd lost months ago, my old hairbrush, a missing earring, even notes I'd thrown away. She'd been collecting pieces of me like evidence, building her case against me for months. By 4 a.m., I realized Leora wasn't just having some kind of mental break, she was dangerous. Her hands shook as she paced the room, muttering about their plans and how she had to stop them before it was too late. The friendly girl who'd been my confidant through high school had completely vanished, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. When she went to the kitchen, I heard her opening drawers, the sound of metal against metal making my skin crawl. I knew I had to get out, but she'd thought of everything. The noise of my breathing seemed deafening in the tense silence, and every creak of the floorboards made her head snap in my direction. The worst part was knowing that somewhere in her mind, she truly believed she was protecting herself. She was convinced that her best friend was an enemy, and nothing I could say would change her mind. Everything came to a head when Leora's parents unexpectedly came home early from their trip. The moment we heard their key in the lock, Leora's face contorted with panic. She grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin, and whispered, "They're not really my parents anymore. They were replaced months ago." Before I could process what was happening, she dragged me into her bedroom closet, pressing a hand over my mouth. I could hear her parents calling out, their footsteps moving through the house. Leora's breathing was erratic, her whole body trembling against mine in the dark closet. I had a terrifying realization. She wasn't just suspicious of me, she believed everyone in her life had been replaced by imposters. When her mom's footsteps approached the bedroom, Leora's grip on me tightened, and she reached for something in the dark. What happened next still haunts me. Leora's mom opened the closet door to find her daughter holding her best friend hostage, convinced we were all part of some grand conspiracy against her. The look in Leora's eyes when the lights came on, it wasn't anger or fear anymore, but something worse, complete disconnect from reality. She was hospitalized that night, and I later learned she'd been experiencing paranoid delusions for months, masterfully hiding them from everyone. Sometimes I still catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone else in my life might be silently watching, documenting, waiting for their moment to reveal that they're not who they seem. The doctors said Leora might recover with treatment, but our friendship never will. The most terrifying part? If her parents hadn't come home early, I don't know what version of this story I'd be telling, or if I'd be here to tell it at all. I never believed in supernatural occurrences until that night 3 weeks ago. My friends and I were having our usual Friday sleepover, sharing ghost stories in my dimly lit living room. The rain outside created the perfect atmosphere, its gentle tapping against the windows almost musical. I was about to share something that had been haunting me for days, a recurring nightmare that felt too real to ignore. Little did I know, telling this story would trigger something I can't explain to this day. The moment I mentioned the Grim Reaper, the room temperature dropped noticeably. Sarah wrapped herself tighter in her blanket, while Emma moved closer to the light. I remember looking at the window, the darkness outside seeming somehow deeper than usual. My hands were shaking as I began describing how, in my nightmare, I'd seen a tall, dark figure standing outside my bedroom window, its hollow eyes fixed on me. The others leaned in, captivated by my story, unaware that reality was about to become far more terrifying than any nightmare I could describe. The nightmare had started the same way every time, at exactly 3:33 a.m. In it, I would wake up to an overwhelming sense of being watched. The air would feel thick, making it difficult to breathe, and my room would be bathed in an unnatural bluish light. But the worst part was always the window. There, standing just outside, would be a figure so tall it had to hunch to peer inside. Its face, if you could call it that, was hidden beneath a dark hood, but those eyes, those hollow, glowing eyes, seemed to pierce right through me. Every time I had this dream, the figure would get closer to the window, and on the last night, its bony hand had actually pressed against the glass. The most terrifying part was how the glass seemed to frost over from its touch, spreading like spidery veins across the entire window. I'd wake up screaming every time, only to find my actual window completely normal, though the room would be freezing cold. But as I shared this with my friends that night, something happened that made me question everything I knew about reality. As I reached the part about the frosted glass in my story, my voice suddenly caught in my throat. The living room window blinds, which had been drawn for our scary story session, began to move. Not just a slight flutter, they started rolling up on their own, slowly and steadily, as if pulled by invisible hands. We all froze, our eyes fixed on the ascending blinds. Nobody was near the window, and there was no breeze or logical explanation for what we were witnessing. The mechanical clicking of the blind's mechanism echoed through the silent room, each notch sending chills down our spines. Emma started crying silently, while Sarah grabbed my arm so tight it left marks. When the blinds reached the top, we could see nothing but pitch darkness outside. But then, something moved in that darkness. A faint outline, tall and cloaked, shifted slightly, and I swear I saw a glimpse of those same hollow glowing eyes from my nightmare. What happened next defies all logical explanation. The window began to frost over, exactly like in my nightmare, starting from the bottom corner and spreading upward in intricate, icy patterns. The temperature in the room plunged so low we could see our breath. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the very air had frozen in her throat. Emma made a dash for the light switch, but the moment her fingers touched it, every bulb in the house exploded simultaneously, showering us with tiny glass fragments. In the pitch darkness, those eyes seemed to grow brighter, and now we could all clearly see the figure outside. It was impossibly tall, its hooded head nearly touching the top of the second-story window. Its bony hand pressed against the glass, leaving a handprint that glowed with an eerie blue light. The frost spread from its touch, creating patterns that looked like ancient symbols we couldn't understand. In the darkness, our phones suddenly lit up simultaneously, all displaying the same time, 3:33 a.m. The figure outside began to move, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. As it leaned closer to the window, we could hear a sound that I'll never forget, a deep, resonating hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The frost patterns on the window began to glow, casting strange shadows that danced across our faces. The figure raised its other hand, and in it, we could see what looked like an ancient hourglass filled with swirling black sand. With horror, I realized that some of the names etched in the frost were ours. The figure's hood shifted slightly, revealing what lay beneath, or rather, what didn't. There was nothing but swirling darkness where a face should have been, except for those piercing, glowing eyes. The window began to vibrate, the glass rattling in its frame with increasing intensity. The humming grew louder, becoming almost unbearable, and the frost patterns started to pulse with a rhythmic blue light. The figure outside raised both hands now, and the hourglass in its grip began to spin, the black sand within it defying gravity. Sarah had passed out beside me, while Emma was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. I felt an overwhelming urge to approach the window, my body moving against my will. As I got closer, I could see that the frost patterns were actually moving, shifting and rearranging themselves into what looked like a doorway. The figure's eyes locked with mine, and in that moment, I understood with horrifying clarity that this wasn't just a visit, it was an invitation. The glass began to crack, tiny fissures spreading outward from the handprint like a spider's web. What saved us that night wasn't bravery or quick thinking, it was sunrise. Just as the glass was about to shatter completely, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. The figure recoiled as if struck, the frost patterns melting instantly. The humming stopped, and the darkness where it stood seemed to fold in on itself, taking the figure with it. When we finally dared to move, we found Sarah still unconscious, Emma catatonic, and the window completely normal, except for one detail. Etched permanently into the glass was a single symbol, one that I've since found in ancient texts about death omens. The strangest part? Every night since then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., all our phones receive the same message, a single hourglass emoji. We know it's counting down to something, but we're too terrified to find out what. Sometimes, late at night, I still see those eyes in the darkness outside my window, waiting. And the blinds? They never roll up on their own anymore. They just disintegrate, turning to dust every time we try to install new ones.